Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 5 of the Bhagavad Gita, which is called Renounce and Rejoice in the Easwaran translation. Last time we wrapped up Chapter 4, in which Lord Krishna placed spiritual wisdom at the top of the list in terms of things we should be concerned with in this life. And today we're going to be talking about renunciation or sannyasa, which is a perennial theme throughout the Gita. And it kind of harkens back to this question that Arjuna posed to Krishna in the very first chapter. The very beginning of the Gita, we see Arjuna wrestling with what he takes to be an implicit and unavoidable contradiction within his own belief system. This question of where exactly the renunciate path falls in relation to the path of action in the world. And as he posits at the beginning of chapter 5, he wants to know which one is better. He says, Krishna, you have recommended both the path of selfless action and the path of renunciation of action. Tell me definitely which is better. And characteristically, Krishna gives him an answer that really highlights the problem with Arjuna's question. Again, Krishna is very compassionate. He is very, very patient with Arjuna. I mean, we're a third of the way through this book, or almost a third of the way, and Arjuna is still not quite getting it. Maybe some of us are still not quite getting it. I know that when I read this the first time, I was still very confused. I guess even today I'm still a little confused, to be honest, which is why I continue to read and study this book. But characteristically, Krishna answers in a way that highlights at least one issue with the question Arjuna is putting forth, which is that it is assuming a dichotomy which may or may not actually be there. Maybe there's a way around this binary way of thinking. Krishna seems to be implying that there is. The best place, or at least the place that's speaking to me on this reread of the Gita, comes in verses 10 through 12. That's where I want to kind of focus in this talk, because that's what's really drawing me in this time around. These verses read as follows. Krishna says, those who surrender to Brahman all selfish attachments are like the leaf of a lotus floating clean and dry in water. Sin cannot touch them. Renouncing their selfish attachments, those who follow the path of service work with body, senses, and mind for the sake of self-purification. Those whose consciousness is unified abandon all attachments to the results of action and attain supreme peace. But those whose desires are fragmented, who are selfishly attached to the results of their work, are bound in everything they do. I love this because it's a very clear delineation between two approaches. One which attains supreme peace, and one which, well, doesn't. It attains bondage, or maintains bondage, whichever way you want to slice it. There's one word in this that was really jumping out to me throughout this chapter, and that is unity. Krishna says, those whose consciousness is unified abandon all attachment to the results of action and attain supreme peace. He mentions this word unified, or unity, or union, at least like a half a dozen times, I counted, if I'm counting correctly, in this chapter. And just for context, this chapter is only about 4 or 5 pages long. He consistently refers to the unification of consciousness, to having a unified mind. And he's very clear about what the effects of having such a consciousness are, of having a unified consciousness versus one that is fragmented, versus one that is bound, versus one that is attached. Paradoxically, it seems he's saying that when you are unified in consciousness, you can actually stand in the midst of quite a lot of things that to the average onlooker might seem like a really bad idea. Like if you see somebody who claims they're a spiritual aspirant, but is surrounded by chaos and discord and strife or worldliness, lust, materialism, somebody who isn't aware of what Krishna is trying to highlight here might look at that and say, well, that seems rather incongruous. On the contrary, though, it actually makes a lot of sense. Let me reread one portion of this, and then I'll give an example. So in verse 11, remember, he says, renouncing their selfish attachments, those who follow the path of service work with body, senses, and mind for the sake of self-purification. That's really interesting. The path of service, or those who follow the path of service, they work with body, senses, and mind for the sake of self-purification. So here I think he's highlighting one of the senses in which renunciation, a complete renunciation, and the path of service or the path of karma yoga are incompatible, as Krishna seems to intuit. As Arjuna seems to intuit at the beginning of this chapter. But on the other hand, what Krishna is also trying to highlight is that to just act in the world without any attention to what you're doing or how you're doing it or what your attitude is about it is not going to yield you the kind of results that you would be looking for if you are looking for spiritual wisdom. Like, two people could take the same path. They could do the same career, for example. And one person could approach it with the kind of knowledge of the true nature of the self that Krishna highlighted, particularly in chapter 2, but ultimately throughout the entire Gita. The true nature of the self, somebody can operate with that and say, okay, well, I am not the doer. As he says in verse 8, he says, those who know this truth, whose consciousness is unified, there's that unified consciousness again. He says, those who know this truth think always, I am not the doer. So somebody could be a bank owner. They could own a bank or a big Fortune 500 company, but the whole time think, I am not the doer. You know, it's all, if apparently God wants to own a Fortune 500 company. That's all that's going on here. It's not me. It's just, for some reason, God wants to play out the trip of being a bank owner or a big company owner. I won't question it. You know, I guess that's just what God wants to do. That's all that's happening. Somebody else who's not operating with that understanding, who's in charge of some other big company, some other bank, following the same career, could think, you know, well, I've got to make sure all the money keeps coming in. I've got to make sure that we keep our sales up to a certain quota. You know, I've got to make sure we this and that, and I'm the one doing all this. That person's desires are going to be fragmented. Their consciousness is not unified. They are attached to the results of their work. Whereas the other person who is in charge of a Fortune 500 company, but has this idea of I'm not the one doing this, it's just God playing out this trip. They could care less whether the company goes under one day or makes more money than it ever has another. That's not what's important to them. What's important to them is that they perform their work, whatever it happens to be, conscientiously, mindfully, and with this understanding that it's actually not them doing anything. It's one way of putting it, at least. The other reason this interests me is it reminds me of a story I was told. I was told by a friend of mine named Jim. Jim's an older man, at least he's older than me, And Jim works in a recovery house. So he is himself in recovery from drug addiction for quite a number of years. And he works in this house where they have patients or clients, whatever you would call them, who are newly sober or newly clean from drugs. And they live there while they kind of get their feet on the ground and get their lives going again. Unfortunately, not all of just the nature of what addiction is, not all of them stick it out the whole way through. And when that happens, like for example, when someone relapses in this house, one of Jim's duties is to drive them to a homeless shelter nearby where they're allowed to kind of dry out for a few days, collect themselves, and then they can come back and give it another go. But while they're under the influence, of course, they can't be in the house, so they have to leave for a few days. So Jim was telling me this story about this young guy, this 18, 19-year-old kid that was living in the house for a while. And after a month or so, he just left one day, bought drugs, came back to the house and got high. And he got caught, so he got kicked out. And Jim was driving him to the homeless shelter. And my friend Jim said that at this point, this young kid was like visibly inebriated. You could tell he was high. And he started apologizing to my friend Jim. And Jim told me he was confused by this. And he said, well, what are you saying? What are you apologizing for? And the kid told him that he felt bad because as he was getting driven, he thought that his inebriation was somehow tempting Jim or triggering him to maybe want to get high himself. And Jim told me that when this kid said that, he kind of just looked at him with this look of bewilderment and incredulousness, like he didn't even answer him. And my friend Jim told me that all that was going through his mind at that time was, my God, this kid is so attached to these chemicals that he actually thinks I'm jealous of him. Like, this kid was going to be on the street for the foreseeable future. As a consequence of his choices. My friend Jim was going to get to go home, live in a nice house, in a nice warm bed, as a consequence of his choices. There was absolutely no part of him that was jealous of this kid's inebriation, even though Jim may or may not have, at one time in his life, done the same kind of chemicals that this kid had ingested at that time. And the way I look at that in this context is that my friend Jim, who was, in recovery for quite a long time at that point, he was unified in his consciousness. Unlike this young guy, this young kid, his desires are totally fragmented. Like, think about it. On some level, part of him must have wanted to get clean. That's why he was in this house in the first place. But then another part of him wanted to get high. So you got fragmented desires, and just so happened that getting high was the one that won out that time. But Jim, his consciousness was totally unified. Like, he could stand in the midst of total chaos. He could stand in the midst of temptation, so to speak, and not feel any attachment for it. This is the product of years of practice. Like I said, my friend Jim is older. He's got a lot of experience being in recovery, dealing with this kind of thing. Someone who's very new to the whole process, that situation could be very dangerous. But my friend Jim, who's an older guy with a lot of experience, his consciousness was pretty solid, pretty unified. From his mind, what he was doing was being of service. He was being of service to the guys in this house that he works in. He was being of service in a way to this young guy who had made a, unfortunately bad decision. He was trying to talk to him, trying to help him to whatever extent he could. And he could be around that without feeling any kind of attachment, or aversion, because I'm sure this young guy wasn't exactly the most polite when he was talking to my friend, because, he's probably a little pissed off about the whole situation. But my friend Jim was unified in his consciousness, so he could stand in the trenches, he could stand in the crossfire, and stand in the midst of this chaos that this young man was creating, and not feel attached or averse. And I think that's kind of cool. That's what I was reminded of when I read these two or three verses here. We can extrapolate that and apply it to pretty much anything. Like when we're unified in consciousness, when we have singleness of mind and singleness of purpose, when we have purity of heart, as Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard calls it, when our desires are actually single, when they are actually rooted in one thing, paradoxically, we can actually do a lot more. That's the coolest thing about this, I think, is that when we're unified in our consciousness, when our desires are not all over the place, we can actually have access to a lot more things and to a deeper appreciation of some of those things. Like going back to where it says, those who follow the path of service work with body, senses, and mind for the sake of self-purification. That means there's a lot that I can actually do. I don't have to stop, for example, making YouTube videos. If I want to do the karma yoga path, if I want to, because I can take that and use that. I don't always do this. I'm just saying I can. And when I do, I feel a lot better. But I can take this process, take this creative work, and use it as a means of gaining clarity on the true nature of my mind. I can use it to gain clarity on the true nature of the self. I can to get closer to God, which can sound kind of weird. Like, how do you get closer to God? By getting in front of a camera and talking about, like, Karl Marx, for example, because I do a lot of videos on Marx. How do I get closer to God by doing that? Well, I suppose I could probably devote an entire talk to just that, but suffice it to say, when I take like a Western philosopher's work and I don't agree with it, but I spend time trying to understand their point of view, and present that point of view in a way that's unbiased, what I'm doing is I'm kind of giving somebody else the stage. I'm really giving someone else the stage, someone else the floor. I'm giving a philosopher the opportunity to have their ideas heard in a way that's hopefully clear and accessible, whether I agree with those ideas or not. In that sense, I'm kind of putting my own ego, my own interests aside. I'm saying you're going to have to wait over here, because right now I'm engaging with some work that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think other people might find helpful to learn about. If it was all about ego, if it's always about what I want, then I would only present philosophers whose ideas I happen to like. Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, that's not how philosophy works. I don't get to pick and choose who I talk about and who I study. I kind of have to learn as much as I can. So in a way, studying secular philosophy with this attitude in mind has at least the potential for me to develop a quality and a space which is highly amenable to precisely the kind of space that I try to cultivate in like meditation or yoga or prayer or mantra or any of the other tools that I use in my spiritual toolkit to get close to the divine. One of the qualities of that space that I'm highlighting here is openness. So openness of mind, openness to ideas that I don't necessarily agree with, but think are important to talk about. In that sense, I'm sure the one talking in front of the camera, but I'm really trying to act as a mouthpiece for some other philosopher who is long deceased, and trying to articulate their ideas in a way that's accessible, hopefully, to other people, so they can make their own decisions about whether these ideas are any good or not, and not trying to coerce people in any way in terms of like whether they should accept something or not. So the point that I'm trying to arrive at here, I don't know if my consciousness is quite unified tonight, at least at the level of my speech. I think my thoughts may be kind of all over the place. I apologize. Hopefully people were able to take something out of this. The point that I'm trying to arrive at is that there is this beautiful paradox that Krishna puts forward in response to Arjuna's question of which path is better. First of all, he's like, well, maybe it's not such a sharp dichotomy that you think it is. And second of all, he highlights this paradox of when your consciousness is unified, there's a lot more that you have access to work with and play with and experiment with, and develop a deeper, more mature relationship with. So I don't have to stop making philosophy videos. I don't have to stop playing guitar. I don't have to stop having relationships, because all of those can, not saying that they do, but can be used as Krishna says, can be used for the sake of self-purification. I probably shouldn't have even mentioned the relationship thing, because that, again, deserves like its whole series, let alone its own talk. How do you take a relationship and turn that into self-purification? That's like a whole other thing. My God. Maybe someday we'll explore that. That would be cool. Really hope people are continuing to enjoy these. Like I say every time, this is one of the most important things for me to do on this channel, is to give space for the Gita. It brings me back down to earth, I guess is the best way to say it, which might sound kind of weird because this is kind of a pretty spacey book. There's a lot of trippy stuff going on, but this actually brings me back down to earth, because when I'm in philosophy land, dealing with all these abstract concepts and these old ideas and old thinkers, I can actually forget that I live in a world with other people, and that there is this deeper stuff that's actually going on beyond all of the fascinating arguments from secular philosophy. All that notwithstanding, there is this deeper stuff going on, this deeper truth, that the Gita is just an absolute treasure trove of information on. And I am very grateful for the opportunity to share my experience with this book, however spacey and all over the place it might be at times. Hope to see you all next time for chapter 6, where we'll be talking about the practice of meditation. Yeah, that sounds good. Hopefully, maybe that's something I should work on in between this talk and the next one. It's a little bit of meditating, maybe unify things a little bit more. But in any case, thanks again for listening, and I will see you all next time.